Hey everyone, it is Mike again, and I'm back to continue our little chat about the Races of Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, because I want to talk about Pantheon, and as a new YouTuber, I'm starting with the basics. So last week I discussed 5 of the 9 races, basically giving you a summary of the lore behind them to wet your whistle, and today I'm going to cover the last 4. I will link the previous video below along with the links to the races I'm covering today in case you want to find out more, or if you want to support Pantheon, that link will be down there too. Like I also said last week, once there's been more lore established, I will do longer videos about specific races or events in the world. I am huge on lore in video games and MMOs in particular, so I will try to scrounge up as much as I can for you. One thing I also am not sure of is that I'm not sure if these tales that we know so far are their actual creations or the creation myths of the races. But once we find out more, I'll make sure to let you know. Anyway, enough about me. You came here for Pantheon, so let's get started. And we're going to begin this journey today with the Dark Mirror, an aquatic race which opens up all kinds of interesting doors from a gameplay perspective, not only when it comes to the stories and the lore surrounding them, but also when it comes to the visual design. And also that may mean we get some underwater themed mounts like seahorses, or better, I don't think this has ever been done before, but octopus. That would be amazing, but probably wishful thinking. Anyway, so the Dark Mirror were created during a time when the ancient Leviathans were at war and destroying the oceans of Issel. The gods of Issel were of course just too busy fighting amongst themselves, until one goddess named Serenai begged for answers from the spirit of Issel itself, who granted her the ability to create a solution, which she did in the form of the Dark Mirror, or just mirror as they were at that time. And in my mind, that probably went something like this. But probably not. I mean, the mirror, since this again was the pre-dark days, kicked the Leviathans in there, took us and drove them back into the deep dark abyss. After the oceans were saved is when, of course, the gods decided to stop their infighting, and they came together to dote on the little mirror, and they flourished. But even with all the gods playing nice, the mirror held Serenai closest to their hearts, and they lived happily ever after. Just kidding, of course they didn't. That would be completely boring storytelling. So they did live happy, that is until they came to Terminus, because once they entered the seas of Terminus, they found they just couldn't breathe the water like they could on Issel. The god Nithir did sacrifice his body to create a pocket of breathable water, but even though he was a god, I guess he just didn't understand the law of dilution, because eventually the waters just mixed together. Nithir's faithful did stay under the water, knowing they were basically going to drown, and the water even started turning their skin red. Serenai did try to step in and change the mirror's bodies to accept the new water, but she couldn't. So in typical god fashion, she used her own essence to recreate the mirror, giving them lungs and legs so they could survive on land. This, however, did not sit well with the followers of Nithir, who she saved from drowning, because as she stood on the shore after transforming the mirror, they came out of the water and pretty much ripped her apart. The faithful Nithir, which would then be known as the Nithirian Red, their now red skin, eventually returned to the sea with the goal of returning to their original form. The remaining mirror who were left to start anew became really bitter and hateful over the loss of Serenai, but they did manage to subdue the oceans and build a city in her honor. They also seem to have given a personification to the air, known as Ermos, who they blamed for pretty much everything that befell them. So when you see a dark mirror, give them a friendly wave and a curse Ermos, because maybe you'll make a friend. Probably not, but you never know. It's worth a shot. But let's move on to the ogres and my piss poor Shrek impressions, who, as we can see here, are large bulky giants that most others consider to be primitive, and the actual lore says uninformed, but I mean, come on, basically that just means they think they're dumb. Except when it comes to war, because you do not want to mess with these guys. They are so warlike that their own gods in their home of Garrock, who were collectively known as the Gravenhold, had to split them up and make the borders between the lands of the 7 tribes sacred so they just wouldn't mass extinct themselves. The Gravenhold did this by giving them 7 books, 1 to each clan, known as the Tomes of War. But not all the sacred information was in the tomes, the rest they put in this indecipherable labyrinth of runes. This was actually pretty smart, since if you want to make a group not known for their intelligence do what you want them to, put it in a book and then just say, hey, this book says this. Boom. The Gravenhold also told them that if any of the books were destroyed, they would allow the ogres to be as well, basically keeping them from killing themselves with, hey, look at the shiny. And this did work, basically, as the clans thrived independently until, that is, of course, they came to Terminus. Because after those borders were gone, all hell broke loose and they started destroying each other, till one of them actually cracked a book. This ogre was known as Rothok, Lord of the Black Moon Clan. He took his people to the mountains in the south and retreated into a cave where he was gone for weeks reading his clan's tome. The Dark Sun in the meantime tracked down the Black Moon and started slaughtering them, but Rothok came out and basically ground them to a pulp, leaving no survivors. He then claimed rulership over the entirety of the ogre clans, killing the remaining leaders and taking their books. After this was done, he claimed an ancient shrine to the Dragon King of Terminus, destroying a statue and placing his throne inside the mouth of the remnants of that statue, before starting a campaign of conquest over the entire continent of Rainfall. But that didn't last long, as he eventually just went nuts and ran off with the books. Without a leader, the ogre started their infighting again and nearly destroyed themselves, until a common enemy known as the Revenant created new leaders amongst the ogre who are trying to again unify the clans and find the lost tomes. And now the Halflings. And first things first, shout out to the designer for not going overly cutesy and kawaii like so many other companies do with their more vertically challenged races. Bravo! And this is actually the lightest lore and the lore filled with the least turmoil, as the Halflings are a really fun and jubilant race. On their homeworld of Harith, they began as nomadic people of a more full stature, we will say, and loved by being known as Kieran, the Ward of Flame. Kieran was not supposed to be the one to take care of the Kiri, as they called himself in his honor, so he wasn't allowed to talk to them, but he figured out a way of communicating without actually communicating. And at this time, the Kiri were also constantly fleeing the Farath, which is basically why they were nomadic. The Farath just would never allow them to settle down. Then along came Marthus, who basically said, hey, you know what? I'm done with this running, we need to stand up for ourselves and we need to fight these people. And he convinced the other Halflings, or Kiri as they were at the time, to set up a defense in the Omel Mountains. During the battle, Kieran grabbed Marthus with the first magic, the ability to wield flame, which is a pretty damn cool intro to magic if you ask me. And the Farath just ran. It was basically a case of stand up to your bully because they aren't really that tough when push comes to shove. Kieran, however, did also leave them at this time, returning to his own charges. Now having claimed a place for themselves, the Kiri founded the town of Kiransan, in which they were able to flourish under the leader of King Marthus. Then now it gets really fairy tale-esque and is actually a real kind of interesting turn. So generations later, on the night of the coronation on King Olinsbeth Molths, I believe, also known as the Laughing Wraith, who had his own kingdom far below Kiransan, offered the new king either eternal life or a peaceful reign. And when the king chose immortality, Molths flew into the air like I could only assume a cartoon villain would, and cursed the Kiri to live their 9 lives in perpetual youth for 10 generations, after which they would turn to spirit form and he would use their spirits to return to physical life himself. Like every good fairy tale, after just 5 generations, Molths was challenged by a Kiri maiden to solve a riddle, and of course he was like, yeah, ask me anything, I am just that good. And then he lost, losing his trademark laugh to the Kiri and lifting the curse, but still leaving them small and youthful, thus they became known as the Halflings. On Terminus, they remain a happy-go-lucky people who enjoy good song and dance and have a fondness for travel. They're also known for their wraith hunting, since they believe Molths is also residing in Terminus, and they are on constant hunt for him and his ilk. Finally, it is time for the last of the 9 races, the Gnomes, also one of the more interesting bits of lore. In most fantasy, I find Gnomes one of the least interesting races, but they were able to take everything we think about when it comes to the Gnomish and do something incredibly interesting with it. The Gnomes originated on a planet known as Stormona, and it was literally a small star that had been encased by stone. I can't really say for certain, but the lore makes it sound like this happened naturally somehow. As there were no other stars nearby, the surface of Stormona was in perpetual chilly twilight, yet
life finds a way.
In the form of the Gnomes. The Gnomes also had a myth that once a generation, when the small light of the nearby stars briefly fell dark, the light of Aeolos, the star at the center of the planet, would shine through the cracks on the surface, and once during this time, a group of gnomes actually went down into the cracks on the crust, and lo and behold, they saw the light. Now, the gnomes who didn't believe this nonsense also didn't believe that they saw anything or the rock they brought back with them was any evidence. But part of the gnomes believed it so strongly they returned to the underground in search of Aeolos. And in a twist, the deeper they went underground, the brighter it got, and their eyes and their bodies, which had evolved in near darkness, just couldn't take it. So it took generations for them to dig deep enough, as they slowly had to evolve and adapt. Finally, they got to Elos, which floated before them and even had smaller planets orbiting around it inside what I really in my head is going to say is a chocolatey shell. The stone walls of the cavern were also infused with what was known as Elos fire, and they called this new mineral reservoir. From reservoir, they could draw out immense arcane energy and fuse it into their bodies, giving them powers greater than a gnome had ever seen before. Those who were able to infuse and wield this power were from then on known as the Arcanos. Reservoir became a drug to the Arcanos, who wanted as much as they could, all other gnomes be damned. Some of the gnomes did complain to the elders and they wanted the use of Elos fire restricted, but this did not sit well, and the Arcanos labeled these gnomes as the profane and exiled them to a small floating prison known as Skyhold, made up of spent reservoir. They literally threw these gnomes into the garbage. But what the elders and the Arcanos didn't know was that reservoir could be recharged, and once discovering this, the profane used that to their advantage, building a huge pillar within the heart of the Skyhold, aimed down at Elos. Now, eventually Elos did just completely destabilize and started having these weird surges of energy, which pretty much just vaporized all the gnomes. But fortunately, Skyhold was so well constructed, it withstood most of the fury, and the remaining gnomes were able to pilot it out through a hole in the crust that had also been created by one of the surges of Elos. It wasn't all hunky-dory though, as the surge of energy consumed the bodies of the gnomes of Skyhold as well. However, before all was lost, using this energy, the gnomes were able to abandon their physical bodies and possess Makesh, a cloth constructed from the reservoir. So gnomes are basically disembodied spirits, and I believe what we see as the bodies of the gnome is this Makesh. That's how I understand it anyway. Skyhold eventually made its way to Terminus and floats above the White Thought, and the gnomes know more peace now than ever in their history. And that is it. That is all 9 races of Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. But that does not mean it will end here, because there is more lore on the world to cover, and I do intend to do more on the lore as we learn it. Both abbreviated versions for those who are merely curious or short on time, and longer versions for those who want to know all those nitty-gritty details. So if you're interested in Pantheon or anything else I'd like to chat about, be sure to like and subscribe. And again, everything I talked about today is linked below, as is the link to support Pantheon and get in on the ground floor, and my social media in case you want to follow me there. But as per the usual, it has been a hoot, and until next time, have fun.